Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're going to tackle a really powerful and, let's be honest, deeply controversial idea: the British mission to civilize India using education. What happens when one culture decides it knows what's best for another?
So you have the British in India, and they see themselves as being on this grand cultural mission. They genuinely believed it was their moral duty to change Indian customs, traditions, and values. But what does civilized even mean? And more importantly, who gets to decide?
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the mission itself, then get into a huge debate it sparked, look at the one law that changed everything, explore the powerful backlash, and finally, see what a new agenda for national education looked like.
Okay, so let's get into this civilizing mission. For a lot of British officials, this wasn't just about grabbing land or collecting taxes. No, they saw themselves on a much bigger, almost moral quest to completely reshape Indian society from the inside. And their number one tool for the job? Education.
But, how exactly do you go about civilizing a nation that has thousands of years of its own history, its own science, its own culture? Well, that question set off a total firestorm. It split British officials into two camps with completely opposite ideas.
So, on one side of this big debate, you had a group we call the Orientalists. These were scholars, and they were absolutely fascinated by India's ancient past. Their thinking was, hey, if we're going to rule this place, we first have to actually understand it.
You had guys like William Jones diving deep into ancient Sanskrit and Persian texts. And this wasn't just for fun, it was a strategy. They set up places you see here, like the Calcutta Madrasa and the Hindu College. The point wasn't to push British ideas, but to study and keep Indian knowledge alive. The whole goal was to position themselves as protectors of the culture, to win the trust of the very people they were ruling.
But of course, this era of respect, well, it wasn't going to last. By the early 1800s, a new, much more aggressive group of British officials came along, and they saw this entire project as a grave error, basically a huge waste of time.
And that brings us to the Anglicists. These guys, led by thinkers like James Mill, had a completely different take. They argued that pretty much all knowledge from the East was unscientific, full of mistakes, and just plain wrong. For them, the only way forward was to replace it, not respect it.
So let's just pause and look at this clash head-on. On one side, you have the Orientalists, who are all about respect and preservation, and on the other, you've got the Anglicists, who are demanding a total cultural wipe and replacement. This wasn't some quiet academic debate. This was a battle for the future of India. So who won this fight? Which vision came out on top? Well, the answer would go on to reshape the entire subcontinent for more than a century.
The real heavyweight champion for the Anglicist cause was this guy, Thomas Babington Macaulay. He was a brilliant, incredibly powerful official who had nothing but contempt for Indian culture. He saw it as primitive and believed it desperately needed a dose of Western thinking to be saved.
And look, if you want to understand just how dismissive he was, you just have to read this one quote. It's famous for a reason. He said that a single shelf of a good European library was worth more than all the literature of India and Arabia combined. Think about that. We're talking centuries of poetry, science, philosophy, all dismissed in one sentence. And this wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark. It became the basis for policy.
And his ideas weren't just talk. They became law with the English Education Act of 1835. The effect was immediate. English was made the official language for higher education, for government, for opportunity. All that funding for the Oriental schools, cut off. They were called temples of darkness and just left to decay. Okay, so that's the British side. But how did Indians actually feel about this so-called civilizing mission? Well, for many, it didn't feel like a gift at all. It felt like an attack. You have to ask, can you really call it civilizing when you're telling an entire people that their language is inferior and their culture is worthless? Forcing a foreign language on people isn't education. It's a tool of control designed to cut them off from their own heritage.
And one of the most powerful voices pushing back was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. He did not hold back. He called English education a poison. He said it was sinful, that it was designed not to free minds, but to enslave them and make Indians feel inferior in their own country. And this really gets to the heart of his argument, right? For Gandhi, the system wasn't about uplifting anyone. It was about making Indians admire their rulers.
It created a deep sense of inferiority, it crushed any pride in local culture, and worst of all, it turned educated Indians into strangers in their own lands, totally disconnected from the majority of their own people.
But it wasn't all just about criticizing the British. This whole experience sparked a really important conversation. What should education for a free, independent India actually look like?
And you had these two incredible thinkers, Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore, who offered different ways forward. Gandhi was all about self-reliance, an education based in Indian languages and practical skills like crafts. Tagore, on the other hand, he imagined a blend, a place where the best of Indian and Western traditions could come together to spark creativity. And he actually built that place, his school, Shantiniketan.
And that really leaves us with this big, lingering question, doesn't it? This debate over what education should be, what language it should be in, what values it should teach, it didn't just stop when India became independent. This fight to decolonize the mind, to build an education system that builds people up instead of alienating them, that's a struggle that is still very much alive in countries all over the world today.